My son leaned closer to the translator, lowering his voice just enough to seem polite, but not enough to escape my ears. I kept my gaze on my plate, gently pressing my fork into a slice of beef I hadn't tasted. Then he said it. A sentence so cold, so calculated, that for a moment I forgot how to breathe. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I understood it perfectly. And he thought I didn't. You see, when you reach my age, people stop seeing you. They don't say it out loud. No, they're far more subtle than that. They talk over you, around you, through you. Like you're a chair in the corner, or a painting on the wall. That night, sitting across from my own son in a room full of strangers, I realized something I never thought possible. My son didn't just overlook me. He erased me. Right there at that table, while I sat beside him. My son thought I was too old to understand him. Too slow. Too out of touch. Too far removed from the world he now lived in. And maybe you've met someone like that before. Someone who assumes silence means ignorance. Someone who mistakes kindness for weakness. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been disrespected right in front of you, and the person didn't even try to hide it? Have you ever sat there, knowing exactly what was happening, but realizing they believed you were too small to notice? It's a strange kind of pain. Not loud, not dramatic. Just quiet and sharp. The kind that settles deep in your chest and stays there. Because that's what this really is. Not just a story about a dinner. Not even about business. It's about what happens when people decide you no longer matter. When your voice is dismissed. Your presence reduced. And your worth quietly rewritten without your permission. That night, I wasn't a mother. I wasn't even a guest. To my own son, I was nothing more than decoration. But what he didn't know, what he never cared to find out, was that I understood every single word spoken at that table. Every whisper. Every side comment. Every lie. And what he said next. What he planned. What he believed he could get away with. Changed everything between us. You see, there was a time in my life that my son barely remembers. A time before his suits, his meetings, his polished voice. A time when I lived halfway across the world. In a place where silence doesn't mean weakness. It means patience. And listening is power. That night, in that restaurant, surrounded by polite smiles and lowered voices, I wasn't lost. I wasn't confused. I was listening. So I sat there. Still. Quiet. Unmoving. While my son spoke freely. Confident that I understood nothing. And I let him. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing a person can do is assume the one listening doesn't understand. If this happened in your family, would you stay silent? Subscribe. People often mistake quiet for weakness. I've learned not to correct them. It saves time. At my age, you begin to notice how quickly others make decisions about you. They see the gray hair, the slower steps, the careful movements, and they fill in the rest of the story themselves. Fragile. Outdated. Irrelevant. I let them believe it. Not because it's true, but because it reveals far more about them than it ever does about me. I've lived long enough to understand that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control. That night, I wasn't the loudest, but I was the most aware. Sila's wasn't always like this. There was a time when he looked at me as though I held the answers to everything. When he was a boy, he used to follow me from room to room, asking questions that never seemed to end. Why does the sky change color? Why do people lie? Why do some people get rich and others do? He believed I knew things. And in those moments, I suppose I did. I taught him how to read before he started school. Showed him how to listen carefully when others spoke. Told him that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you gave first. He listened back then. He really did. But something changed. It didn't happen overnight. There was no single moment where I could say, that's when I lost him. It was slower than that. Subtle. At first, it was the phone calls that grew shorter. Then the visits that became less frequent. Then the way he started checking his watch while I spoke. As though time with me had become something to manage, instead of something to value. Success found him quickly. Faster than I expected. And with it came a version of him I barely recognized. Sharper. Colder. More concerned with how things looked than what they meant. By the time that dinner came around, Silas had built a life that looked impressive from the outside. Tailored suits. Expensive watches. A voice that carried confidence in every room he entered. People listened when he spoke. They nodded. They agreed. And he had grown used to that. Used to being the center of attention. Used to being the one in control. But somewhere along the way, he stopped listening. Not just to others. To me. He never raised his voice at me. Never said anything openly cruel. That would have been easier to confront. Instead, it was the small things. The kind that build over time. The way he introduced me that night. This is my mother. She prefers to keep to herself. A sentence that sounded harmless. Polite, even. But it wasn't true. I didn't prefer silence. I had simply learned that speaking didn't always mean being heard. Then there was the way he avoided eye contact when I asked simple questions. Or how he would answer for me before I had the chance to respond. Each moment, on its own, meant very little. Together, they told a different story. Silas believed he understood me. That was his first mistake. He thought my world was small. That my experiences were limited to the life he had seen. That everything important about me had already been revealed. He never asked deeper questions. Never wondered who I had been before I became his mother. To him, I was a fixed image. Unchanging. Predictable. Safe. And most importantly, uninformed. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you raised become a stranger? Not all at once. Not in a dramatic way. But piece by piece. Until one day, you're sitting across from them. And you realize you no longer recognize the person looking back at you. It's not anger you feel first. It's something quieter than that. Something heavier. Because you remember who they used to be. Part of me wanted to believe I was imagining it. That maybe I was being too sensitive. That maybe this was just what happens when children grow into their own lives. But deep down, I knew better. Respect doesn't disappear by accident. It fades when it's no longer valued. And that's exactly what had happened. Silas didn't think he was doing anything wrong. That's what made it worse. What he didn't understand, what he never took the time to uncover, was that I had lived a life long before he ever entered it. A life filled with decisions, risks, and experiences he had never asked about. Not because they weren't important, but because he assumed they were. And assumptions can be very expensive. There was something about me Silas never bothered to learn. Not once. Not even out of curiosity. And that night, as he sat across from me, speaking freely, completely at ease, that missing piece became the one thing he would soon regret overlooking. There are entire chapters of a person's life that never get told. Not because they're unimportant, but because no one ever thinks to ask. Silas knew me as his mother. That was the version of me he grew up with. The one who packed his lunches, reminded him to study, and stayed up late when he was sick. But that was only part of who I was. Long before he came into this world, I had already lived a life that would have surprised him. A life shaped by distance, adaptation, and quiet resilience. He never asked about those years. And I never offered. I was 26 when I first arrived in Osaka. I still remember stepping out of the train station, surrounded by a language I couldn't understand and a rhythm that felt entirely unfamiliar. Everything moved quickly. People spoke with purpose. Even the air felt different, charged with motion and intent. At the time, I had no plan beyond staying for a few months. A temporary decision. That's what I told myself. But life has a way of extending moments that matter. What was meant to be brief became something much longer. In the beginning, I relied on gestures more than words. Pointing, nodding, watching carefully before speaking. It wasn't comfortable. There were mistakes, many of them. Wrong trains. Misunderstood instructions. Meals ordered without knowing what would arrive. But discomfort has a purpose. It sharpens you, forces you to pay attention. So I listened, closely, to how people spoke, to the way tone changed meaning, to the pauses between sentences. Language, I realized, wasn't just about words. It was about timing, respect, awareness. And slowly, I began to understand. The markets became my classroom. Rows of vendors calling out prices, negotiating with customers, exchanging quick phrases that seemed effortless. At first, it was noise. But over time, patterns began to form. Certain expressions repeated. Certain responses followed. I started recognizing words, then phrases, then entire conversations. There was an elderly woman who sold vegetables near the corner of my street. She noticed me early on. The foreigner who lingered too long, listening more than buying. One day, she spoke to me directly. I didn't understand everything she said, but I understood enough. Enough to respond. Her smile told me I had gotten it right. After that, she spoke to me every time I passed by. And each conversation became a lesson. It didn't happen all at once. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It was gradual. A sentence here, a correction there. Until one day, I realized I was no longer translating in my head. I was simply understanding. And then speaking. Naturally. Comfortably. As though the language had found a place within me. People stopped slowing down their speech when talking to me. They stopped simplifying their words. They spoke normally. And I responded the same way. That's when I knew I had crossed a line, from outsider to participant. Those years in Osaka shaped me in ways I didn't fully appreciate at the time. They taught me patience, how to observe before reacting, how to remain calm when others rushed, and most importantly, how to listen without being noticed. There's a certain strength in that, in being present without drawing attention, in understanding more than people assume you do. It's not loud. It doesn't demand recognition, but it gives you something far more valuable. Control. When I returned home years later, life moved forward as it always does. I built a family, raised my son, watched him grow into the man he is now. And somewhere along the way, that part of my life faded into the background. Not forgotten, just unspoken. Silas never asked about it. Not once. To him, I was simply his mother. Not someone who had once stood in crowded markets, holding conversations in a language he never imagined I could understand. Not someone who had learned to survive in a place where nothing was familiar. And because he never asked, he never knew. Some skills never leave you. They don't disappear with time. They settle quietly, waiting for the moment they're needed again. Most people forget that. They assume if something isn't mentioned, it no longer exists. But silence doesn't erase experience. It only hides it. That night, sitting at that table, surrounded by polite conversation and careful smiles, I wasn't hearing unfamiliar sounds. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't confused. Every word reached me clearly. Every sentence carried meaning. Every assumption my son made about me was wrong. And that night, after all those years, it came back. Not slowly, not uncertainly, but with perfect clarity, the kind that leaves no room for doubt. And as my son continued speaking, completely unaware, I realized something that changed the direction of everything that followed. He wasn't just underestimating me. He was exposing himself. The call came 3 days before the dinner. It was early evening, just as I was settling into the quiet rhythm of the house. I remember noticing the name on my phone before answering. Sila's. He didn't call often, not without a reason. I let it ring once longer than necessary, then picked up. "Mother," he said, his voice smooth, measured, already moving at a pace that suggested he was thinking about something else. No greeting beyond that. No pause to ask how I was. Just the word, "Mother." "I need a favor." Not "would you," not "could you." Just "I need." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I listened. Not just to what he was saying, but how he was saying it. There was urgency in his tone. Not emotional urgency. Practical. Calculated. The kind that comes when something important is at stake. "I have a dinner coming up," he continued. "Business, very important, I need you to attend." Need. That word again. It wasn't a request. It was a decision he had already made. I asked him a simple question. "What exactly do you need me to do?" There was a brief pause on the other end. Not long. Just enough to suggest he hadn't expected me to ask. Then he answered. "Nothing complicated," he said. "Just be there, sit with us, it helps the image." The image. I let that settle. "And what kind of image would that be?" I asked. He exhaled softly, as though I were making things harder than they needed to be. "Stability," he said. "Family presence, it matters in their culture." Their culture. I almost smiled at that. Then came the part he didn't think twice about. "Just sit there and look presentable," he added. "You don't need to say much." Not harsh. Not loud. Delivered casually. As though it were the most reasonable instruction in the world. But words don't need to be sharp to cut. Sometimes, it's the calm ones that leave the deepest mark. I didn't react the way he expected. There was no offense in my voice. No correction. No challenge. Just silence. Not empty silence. Measured. Intentional. Because in that moment, I understood exactly what he believed about me. What role he had assigned. And more importantly, what he thought I was incapable of. "Who will be there?" I asked. He named the company. A group of executives from Japan. Important people, from the way he described them. People he needed to impress. People whose approval would move his plans forward. "They value respect," he added. "Structure, tradition, that's why this matters." I let him finish. Then I asked one more question. "And you believe I'll help with that?" This time, his pause was slightly longer. "Of course," he said. "You just need to be yourself." Be yourself. It sounded kind. Almost reassuring. But it didn't match what he had already said. He didn't want me there for who I was. He wanted me there for how I appeared. There's a difference. One carries truth. The other, convenience. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't about inclusion. It was about presentation. I could have declined. Easily. Given any number of reasons. But I didn't. Because something in his tone, something in the way he had already decided how the evening would go, made me curious. Not about the dinner. About him. About what he believed he could say freely in my presence. About what he thought I would never understand. So I agreed. "All right," I said calmly. "I'll come." His relief was immediate. Not emotional. Practical. "Good," he replied. "I'll send the details." And just like that, the call ended. I placed the phone down and sat there for a while. The house was silent again. But my thoughts were not. There are moments when you realize a line has been crossed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly. And this was one of them. My son hadn't invited me to share an experience. He had placed me in a role. One that required very little from me. Except silence. What he didn't realize was this. Silence can mean many things. It can be agreement. It can be discomfort. It can even be surrender. But sometimes, silence is preparation. And that night, whether he understood it or not, I was preparing. The next few days passed without much thought from him. No follow-up calls. No conversation. Just a message with the time and location. Efficient. Direct. Detached. I read it once, then set it aside. There was no need to revisit it. I already knew exactly where I would be sitting. Exactly what he expected from me. And exactly how wrong he was. She trusted him, and that nearly destroyed her. Subscribe before the truth drops. The restaurant was exactly what I expected. Refined. Controlled. The kind of place where every detail had been considered long before any guest arrived. Soft lighting rested gently across the tables, never too bright, never too dim. Conversations were kept low, measured, as though the room itself demanded restraint. Even the movement of the staff followed a rhythm, quiet, precise, almost invisible. Silas was already there when I arrived. Standing near the entrance, checking his watch. When he saw me, he offered a brief smile. Polite. Efficient. Right on time, he said, as if punctuality were the most important thing I could offer. No hug. No warmth beyond acknowledgement. Just confirmation that I had fulfilled the first expectation. He guided me toward the table without delay. A subtle hand gesture, directing rather than inviting. The table itself was set for 6. 3 seats already occupied. 3 waiting. As we approached, the men seated there stood in unison. A gesture of respect. Measured, intentional. Silas straightened slightly, his posture shifting the moment attention turned toward him. "This is my mother," he said. The same line. Calm. Controlled. She prefers to keep to herself. Again, that quiet decision made on my behalf. I inclined my head slightly in greeting. Nothing more. And I took my seat. There were 3 of them. Each distinct in presence, yet connected in manner. The first appeared to be the senior among them. His posture was steady, his gaze direct without being intrusive. He spoke first, his voice calm, his words deliberate. The second sat slightly to his right, observing more than speaking. His eyes moved carefully, taking in the room, the people, the details others might miss. The third was younger. Not inexperienced, but still learning. There was a certain alertness in him. A readiness to respond quickly, to prove himself. They greeted me politely. Their tone respectful. Their attention genuine. Very different from what I had grown used to. Between Silas and the guests sat the translator. A young man. Well-dressed but tense. You could see it in the way he adjusted his sleeves. The way he leaned forward slightly, always prepared to speak. Always ready to bridge the gap. His role was important, but also fragile. One mistake, one hesitation, and the entire rhythm of the conversation could shift. He knew it. That awareness sat heavily on him. Menus were presented. Water poured. Small gestures filled the space while everyone adjusted to the setting. Silas began with polite conversation. Carefully chosen words. measured tone. Everything about him was controlled. He was performing, not in an obvious way, but in the subtle adjustments of his voice. The way he smiled slightly longer than necessary. The way he paused just enough to allow translation. Every movement calculated to leave an impression. I said nothing. There was no need. Because when you remove yourself from the need to speak, you begin to see more. Silas leaned forward when addressing the senior guest, but leaned back when the younger one spoke. A small detail, but revealing. Respect was being distributed selectively. His tone shifted depending on who he addressed. Smoother with one, sharper with another. And the translator. He followed closely, trying to maintain pace. Trying not to fall behind. Have you ever stayed quiet just to see who someone really is? Not who they say they are. Not who they pretend to be. But who they become when they believe no one is paying close attention. It's a revealing exercise. Because people relax when they think they're not being judged. And in that comfort, they show more than they intend. At first, everything appeared smooth. Silas spoke with confidence. The guests listened. The translator worked quickly, keeping the flow intact. But small shifts began to appear. Almost unnoticeable. A slight hesitation before certain answers. A glance exchanged between the executives. A pause that lasted just a fraction longer than expected. Silas noticed none of it. He continued speaking, building momentum. But I did. Because I wasn't focused on the words alone. I was watching the reactions. The senior guest adjusted his posture, leaning back slightly. Not disengaged, but no longer leaning forward. The second guest folded his hands together, his gaze steady but less responsive. The younger one stopped nodding as frequently. These were not dramatic changes, but they mattered. Because in conversations like this, what isn't said often carries more weight than what is. Silas's voice grew firmer as the discussion continued. Not louder, just more certain, more assertive, as though he were pushing towards something, trying to guide the direction. The translator followed, but there were moments, brief ones, where he seemed unsure. A slight delay. A quick correction. Nothing obvious, but enough to suggest that something wasn't aligning perfectly. I remained still, listening, understanding. Every word that passed between them, every shift in tone, every detail that might have escaped someone less attentive. Silas believed he was in control of the room, that everything was unfolding exactly as he intended. But control is not always where it appears to be. Sometimes, it sits quietly at the edge of the table, watching, waiting. The conversation moved deeper into business. Numbers, plans, expectations. Silas spoke confidently about outcomes, about timelines, about guarantees. The kind of certainty that sounds impressive, until someone begins to question it. And that moment was approaching. You could feel it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle shift in the air. A change in rhythm. The kind that signals something is about to move in a different direction. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. My expression calm. Unchanged. Exactly as he had instructed. Presentable. Silent. Invisible. And because of that, he continued, speaking freely, without restraint, without caution, without realizing that the one person he had dismissed understood everything. The conversation moved beyond pleasantries. Details replaced introductions. Numbers replaced general statements. This was where the real purpose of the evening began to take shape. Silas leaned forward slightly, his tone steady, his delivery confident. He spoke about growth, about expansion, about opportunities that sounded both promising and immediate. The translator followed closely, carrying his words across the table. And the executives listened. Not casually, carefully. Silas began outlining his company's position. He described it as stable, well-established, free from complications. Every word placed with certainty. No hesitation. No room left for doubt. To someone unfamiliar with the details, it sounded convincing. Impressive, even. But confidence alone does not create truth. Because as I listened, I noticed something. A small detail. Easy to overlook, but impossible to ignore once you understood the context. He mentioned a project timeline, one that didn't match what I knew. Not slightly, significantly. The kind of difference that couldn't be explained by memory or estimation. It was deliberate. Then came another, and another, each statement building on the last. Each one presented with the same level of certainty. But the pattern was clear. He wasn't adjusting facts. He was replacing them, reshaping reality to fit the outcome he wanted. And no one at the table challenged him. Not yet. The translator's role became more difficult. You could see it in the slight delay before he spoke. The way he chose his words more carefully. As though he were trying to balance accuracy with delivery. At one point he paused, just briefly before continuing. A small moment. But telling. Because it suggested he understood something wasn't aligning. Even if he couldn't fully address it. The senior guest remained composed, listening without interruption. But his eyes held a different focus now. More analytical. Less receptive. The second guest shifted slightly in his seat, his attention narrowing. The younger one stopped taking notes. Instead, he watched Silas directly. No longer following the translator alone. They weren't reacting openly, but they were assessing. Then came the part that mattered most. Not what he said, but what he didn't say. He spoke about financial stability, but avoided recent losses. He spoke about ongoing partnerships, but failed to mention the ones that had quietly ended. And most importantly, he said nothing about the legal issues. Nothing about the cases still unresolved. The kind of details that change how everything else is perceived. I understood all of it. Every omission. Every altered detail. Every carefully shaped statement. Because this wasn't just a conversation. It was a construction. A version of reality built for a specific purpose. And the more he spoke, the clearer it became. There's a difference between confidence and deception. One builds trust. The other risks everything. Silas wasn't just presenting his business. He was misrepresenting it. And he was doing so in front of people who valued precision, clarity, honesty, the very things he was choosing to ignore. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Something steadier than that. A recognition. That's when I realized. This wasn't just arrogance. Instead of slowing down, Silas leaned in further, as though momentum alone would carry him through. He began making assurances. Guarantees about outcomes that hadn't been secured. Timelines that depended on variables he couldn't control. Each statement stronger than the last. Each one increasing the distance between truth and presentation. And still, no one stopped him. The air at the table shifted. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The pauses grew slightly longer. The responses more measured. The translator's voice carried a hint of caution now, as though he were aware that every word mattered more than before. Silas, however, remained unchanged. Confident, certain, completely unaware of the ground shifting beneath him. I remained exactly where he wanted me. Silent, still, uninvolved, but fully aware. Because silence, when used correctly, is not absence, it's observation. And in that moment, I was seeing everything he hoped would go unnoticed. The conversation was no longer balanced. It had tilted, not enough for an open challenge, but enough to create doubt. And doubt, once introduced, doesn't disappear easily. It grows, quietly, steadily, until it demands attention. Silas continued speaking, uninterrupted, unquestioned, but not unexamined. And the consequences of that were closer than he realized. Ignore signs like this and you'll regret it. Subscribe now. By this point, the conversation had shifted in a way Silas could no longer control, though he didn't realize it yet. The confidence in his voice remained, but the responses across the table had changed. Shorter, more measured, less encouraging. The senior guest leaned back slightly, his expression calm but no longer receptive. The second guest exchanged a brief glance with him. The younger one had stopped writing altogether. And the translator, he hesitated more often now, choosing words carefully, as though aware that something important was about to happen. Silas noticed the shift, but misunderstood it. He mistook caution for confusion. And that was where everything began to turn. The senior guest spoke, his voice calm, direct. A question about one of the timelines Silas had presented earlier. Not confrontational, just precise. Silas responded immediately. Confident, reassuring. But this time, the answer didn't move things forward. It paused them. The translator repeated the response. And for the first time that evening, the room didn't continue. It held still. The second guest followed. Another question. This one more specific, referencing details that required accuracy. Not estimates, not generalizations. Silas answered again. But this time, there was a slight shift. A fraction of a second too long before he spoke. A minor adjustment in tone. Still controlled, but no longer effortless. The translator carried his words across. And again, the pause returned. You could see it now. Not clearly, but enough. The awareness that something wasn't aligning. That the conversation was no longer moving in his favor. Silas adjusted his posture, leaning forward, speaking with more emphasis, as though strength in delivery could compensate for weakness in detail. But pressure doesn't disappear when you push against it. It responds. Instead of addressing the questions directly, Silas shifted the conversation, redirected it, moved toward broader statements, general strengths, future potential, the kind of language that sounds impressive, but avoids specifics. The executives listened, but their attention had changed. They were no longer following him. They were evaluating him. The translator's role became even more difficult. You could hear it now. The slight uncertainty in phrasing. The careful selection of words. As though he were trying to remain accurate, while sensing that accuracy itself was becoming complicated. At one point, he glanced briefly at Silas before continuing. A silent check. A quiet hesitation. Small but meaningful. And then, Silas made a choice. Not a thoughtful one. A reactive one. The kind people make when they feel control slipping. Instead of slowing down. Instead of correcting course. He chose to explain the inconsistencies. Not with facts, but with justification. He let out a small breath. A soft, almost amused sound. Then he gestured lightly in my direction. Casual. Dismissive. My mother, he said, smiling faintly. She sometimes gets confused with details like this. The translator repeated it, word for word. There was no change in tone, no softening, just a direct translation. And just like that, I was no longer invisible. I had been brought into the conversation, not with respect, but as an explanation. Silas continued, as though what he was saying was completely reasonable. She means well, he added, his voice calm, almost reassuring. But she tends to mix things up. Another translation. Another pause. He didn't stop there. She's had a few moments recently, he went on. Nothing serious, just memory issues. The words landed clearly. There was no confusion in them. No misunderstanding. Every person at that table heard exactly what he intended. And what he intended was to reduce me. No one spoke immediately. Not the executives. Not the translator. The air shifted. Not sharply, but definitively. Because what had just happened wasn't business. It was personal. And in that moment, Silas had revealed something far more important than any deal. The senior guest's expression didn't change much, but his gaze moved toward me. Not dismissive. Not questioning. Observing. The second guest remained still, but his focus had sharpened. The younger one looked uncertain, as though trying to understand whether what he had just heard was appropriate. I didn't move. Not immediately. Because reactions, when rushed, often serve the wrong purpose. Inside, I felt it. Not shock. Not even anger in the way most people understand it. Something quieter. Clearer. A line being drawn. He hadn't just dismissed me. He had used me. Turned me into an excuse. A shield. To protect his own position. And he believed I would remain silent. That I would accept it. Because that's what he had come to expect. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from being misunderstood. But this was different. This was intentional. Carefully chosen words. Delivered in a way that made them sound harmless. But their purpose was clear. To discredit. To diminish. To make anything I might say irrelevant before I even spoke. And it came from my own son. What would you do if your own child said this about you? Not in private. Not in frustration. But calmly. In front of strangers. As though it were simply a fact. Would you defend yourself? Would you stay quiet? Or would you wait? For the right moment. Silas gave a small, apologetic smile toward the table. As if to smooth things over. To be honest, he added, it's better if she doesn't get involved in these discussions. The translator repeated it. And this time, there was no pause afterward. Just silence. Complete. Heavy. Final. I remained exactly as I was. Hands folded. Posture straight. Expression unchanged. Everything about me aligned with the role he had assigned. Quiet. Presentable. Uninvolved. But inside, something had shifted completely. Because once someone shows you exactly how they see you, you no longer have to guess. Silas leaned back slightly, as though the situation had been resolved. As though his explanation had restored balance. But he had miscalculated. Not the room. Not the guests. Me. Because silence doesn't always mean acceptance. Sometimes, it means timing. And his time was running out. Most people would break here, but she didn't. Stay with me. The silence that followed his last statement didn't feel accidental. It felt earned. Carefully built over every word he had chosen. Silas sat back in his chair, shoulders relaxed now, as though he had successfully navigated a difficult moment. To him, the tension had passed. The conversation, in his mind, had been corrected. But what he didn't understand was this. Some things don't end when they're spoken. They begin. Across the table, the guests remained composed. Polite. Attentive. But no one rushed to continue. No one filled the space he had created. Because something had shifted beyond business. And everyone present could feel it. Silas reached for his glass. Took a small sip. The kind of gesture people make when they believe they're back in control. Then he leaned slightly toward the translator. Not enough to appear secretive. Just enough to sound casual. As if what he was about to say wasn't important. That was the moment. The exact moment everything crossed a line that couldn't be undone. He spoke again. This time in a tone that wasn't meant for correction. Or explanation. It was conversational. Light. Almost dismissive. My plan, honestly, he said with a faint shrug, is to move her somewhere more manageable soon. The translator hesitated. Just briefly. Then delivered the message. Carefully. Word for word. 8D the first layer, assisted living. Silas continued, barely pausing. There are good facilities, he added. Places where people like her are taken care of properly. People like her. Not my name. Not my mother. Just a category. A type. Something to be placed. Handled. Managed. The translator repeated it. And this time, something in his voice changed. Not incorrect. Not unprofessional. Just heavier. Silas leaned back again. More relaxed now. As though discussing a simple arrangement. It's probably time to sell the house too, he went on. It doesn't make sense keeping it. A small pause. Then, almost as an afterthought. It'll help free up some capital anyway. The translator delivered it. And unlike before, no one reached for their glasses. No one adjusted their posture. No one pretended this was normal. He said it like she wasn't even human. Like I wasn't sitting there. Like I wasn't listening. Like I had already been removed from the decision. The senior guest's gaze shifted again. But this time, it stayed on me longer. Not out of curiosity. Not out of confusion. But recognition. Because respect isn't just shown in words. It's revealed in how people speak about others when they think it doesn't matter. The second guest's expression tightened slightly. Barely noticeable. But enough. The younger one looked down for a moment. As if unsure where to place his attention. And the translator. He didn't look at Silas anymore. Inside, everything became very clear. Not emotional. Not reactive. Clear. There would be no conversation later. No quiet correction. No attempt to understand where he was coming from. Because this wasn't confusion. It was decision. He had already planned it. Organized it. Accepted it. And now, he had spoken it aloud. A home is more than a structure. It carries years. Moments. Silences. Everything that once mattered. And he reduced it to value. To numbers. To something that could be exchanged. Without hesitation. Without thought for what it held. For who it held. Have you ever sat in a room and realized that someone had already made a decision about your life? Without ever asking you. Not out of concern. Not out of necessity. But convenience. What would you do in that moment? Speak. Walk away. Or stay. And let them finish. Silas exhaled softly. As if concluding something reasonable. It's for the best, he added. Simple. Clean. Final. The translator repeated it. But this time, the words didn't land the same way. Because everyone at that table now understood something Silas didn't. This wasn't responsibility. This was removal. I didn't interrupt, didn't react, didn't correct him. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is allow someone to reveal themselves completely. And he wasn't finished. Not yet. There's always a moment. A precise, quiet moment. Where something inside you settles. Not breaks. Settles. Where hesitation disappears. And clarity replaces it. That moment had arrived. Not when he dismissed me. Not when he spoke for me. But here. When he decided my future. As if I had none of my own. Silas believed he had resolved everything. Explained everything. Controlled everything. But what he didn't see was that he had just given me something far more valuable than control. He had given me certainty. And certainty changes everything. First subtle move is made. The power dynamic quietly flips. This is where the story transforms. There's a difference between hearing something and understanding it. That night, I didn't just hear my son speak. I understood him. Completely. Not the version I had raised. Not the boy who once looked to me for guidance. But the man sitting across that table. Calmly deciding what to do with my life. As if I had already been removed from it. And in that understanding, something shifted. Before that moment, there had still been space for doubt. For questions. For quiet hope that perhaps I was misreading things. But clarity leaves no room for hesitation. And what he had revealed, not just in words, but in tone, in posture, in certainty, removed that space entirely. There was nothing left to question. Only something left to decide. People often mistake silence for weakness. They assume that if you don't respond immediately, you have nothing to say. But silence can also be a choice. A pause. A way of watching everything unfold without interference. That had been my role until now. Observer. Listener. Present but not involved. But roles change. And mine had just shifted. I didn't feel the need to interrupt. Didn't feel the urge to defend myself. Because defense suggests vulnerability. And in that moment, I wasn't vulnerable. I was aware. Aware of every word spoken. Every glance exchanged. Every assumption made about me. And awareness, when paired with patience, becomes power. I began to take note of everything. Not outwardly. Not in a way anyone could see. But carefully. Deliberately. Silas's confidence. The way he leaned back when he thought he had resolved something. The slight tension in the translator's voice. The measured responses from the guests. All of it mattered. Because understanding a situation fully is the first step to changing it. What he had done wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a mistake made under pressure. It was structured. Planned. Decided long before we ever sat at that table. And that realization carried weight. Not emotional weight. Strategic weight. Because if something is planned, it can be anticipated. And if it can be anticipated, it can be countered. Strength isn't always loud. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in plain sight. Unnoticed. Underestimated. Waiting. That's what he believed I was. Unaware. Uninformed. Easily managed. And that belief would become his greatest mistake. Have you ever stayed quiet long enough to see someone reveal exactly who they are? Not what they say they are. Not what they pretend to be. But who they become when they think no one is watching. And once you see it, what do you do next? I made a decision then. Not out of anger. Not out of reaction. But with clarity. I would not confront him at that table. Not in that moment. Because timing matters. And premature action often benefits the wrong person. No, this required something else. Something measured. Something precise. Up until that night, I had been part of his world. Included when convenient. Set aside when necessary. But now, I was no longer operating within his expectations. I was outside them. And that changes everything. Because people prepare for what they expect. They rarely prepare for what they don't see coming. Outwardly, nothing about me changed. I remained seated. Composed. Uninvolved. Exactly as he preferred. But internally, every detail was being arranged. Every possibility considered. Every next step forming quietly. This wasn't about reaction anymore. It was about direction. There's a unique advantage in being overlooked. In being dismissed. In being spoken about as though you're not capable of understanding. Because it removes attention. And without attention, there is no defense. Silas believed he had already won. That the outcome was decided. That I would follow the path he had chosen for me. And that belief would leave him completely unprepared. He had no idea what was coming next. The conversation at the table continued. Voices moved. Questions returned. But none of it held the same weight anymore. Because the real shift had already happened. Not in the room. Not in the deal. But within me. And once that shift takes place, everything that follows is no longer accidental. It's intentional. Stay silent too long, and you'll lose everything. Subscribe or explain why not. The conversation resumed. Carefully, as though everyone at the table had agreed, without saying it to proceed, but with caution. Questions returned. Measured. Polite. The translator continued his role, though his rhythm had changed. He no longer spoke with the same ease. There was a weight now. An awareness that something in the room had shifted beyond business. Silas, however, carried on. Confident again. Or at least, attempting to be. He leaned forward, re-engaging the discussion, offering explanations, reinforcing earlier points. From the outside, it may have appeared that control had been restored. But control, once fractured, rarely returns the same way. One of the guests spoke again. A question direct, specific. Something that required clarity. Accuracy. Silas answered. Smoothly. Too smoothly. Because what he offered wasn't truth. It was adjustment. A refinement of earlier statements. A quiet correction disguised as confidence. The translator hesitated before delivering it. And this time, the hesitation lasted longer. Just enough for everyone to notice. That was when I knew. Not emotionally. Not impulsively. But with certainty. The moment had arrived. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because silence had already done its work. Everything that needed to be revealed had been revealed. Now, it was time to be understood. I didn't rush. Didn't raise my voice. Didn't shift dramatically in my seat. I simply turned my head slightly toward the guests. And spoke. In Japanese. Fluent. Clear. Uninterrupted. The first sentence was calm. Respectful. Acknowledging their patience. Thanking them for their time. For their attention. For their professionalism. The effect was immediate. The translator stopped. Mid-motion. His pen hovered just above the page. The younger guest's eyes lifted sharply. The second guest leaned forward, just slightly. And the senior guest held my gaze. Still. Focused. Attentive. Silas didn't move at first. Because understanding takes a moment when it's unexpected. I continued. Still in Japanese. My tone steady. Measured. I addressed the inconsistencies, one by one. Not aggressively, not defensively, just clearly. Timelines, details, statements that had been altered, information that had been presented inaccurately. Everything laid out, without raising my voice, without looking at Silas. Because this wasn't about confronting him. It was about restoring truth. As I spoke, something changed in the room. Not dramatically, but undeniably. The attention that had once been cautious became focused. The uncertainty that had lingered began to settle. Because clarity does that. It replaces doubt with understanding. The senior guest gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The second guest listened without interruption. The younger one began writing again. And the translator lowered his pen because he was no longer needed. It took him a few seconds, maybe more, to fully process what was happening. But when it did, you could see it. The shift, the realization. Not just that I understood, but that I had understood everything. From the beginning. Every word. Every explanation. Every decision made about me. Without me. His posture changed. Slightly. The confidence that had carried him through the evening paused. I finished my explanation calmly. Then, still in Japanese, I clarified one final point. That I had chosen not to interrupt earlier. Out of respect. For the setting. For the conversation. For him. A brief pause. Then I added. That respect, however, is not something that can exist on one side alone. The words were simple, but their meaning was not. When I stopped speaking, no one rushed to fill the space, because nothing needed to be added. Everything had already been said. The kind of silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was conclusive. The senior guest inclined his head slightly toward me. A gesture of acknowledgement, of understanding, of respect. And in that moment, the balance in the room had shifted completely. I didn't look at Silas immediately, because this wasn't about seeing his reaction. It was about allowing him to sit with it, to understand it, fully, without interruption, without distraction. The realization that the person he had dismissed had been the only one who truly understood the room. Have you ever revealed something about yourself? At exactly the right moment. Not to impress, but to correct everything that had been misunderstood. And in doing so, change the way everyone saw you. Only then did I turn my gaze slightly in his direction. Not sharply, not confrontational, just enough. Because acknowledgement doesn't require intensity. It requires presence. And in that moment, he understood, not just what I had said, but what it meant. The conversation didn't end there, but it no longer belonged to him. The control he believed he had shifted, quietly, completely. And the most important part, there was nothing he could say now to reverse it. After I finished speaking, the room didn't return to what it had been. It couldn't, because the foundation of the conversation had changed. Before, everything rested on assumption, on what Silas presented, on what others believed. Now it rested on clarity. And clarity has a way of demanding answers. The senior guest adjusted slightly in his seat, not uncomfortably, but with intention, as though preparing to move forward, just not in the direction Silas expected. A question followed. This time, it wasn't directed at Silas. It was directed at me. Calm, respectful, precise. I answered in the same manner. In Japanese. Clear, measured, no hesitation. And with that exchange, something became undeniable. The conversation had shifted hands. Silas leaned forward quickly. Too quickly. Attempting to re-enter the discussion. To re-establish position. He spoke with urgency now, though he tried to mask it as confidence. Clarifying. Reframing. Adjusting earlier statements. But recovery, when rushed, often reveals more than it repairs. Because every correction he made highlighted something that had already been questioned. I didn't interrupt him. I waited. And when he finished, I spoke again. Calmly. Addressing one specific point. A timeline he had referenced earlier. I clarified it. Accurately. Then another detail. A figure he had mentioned. Adjusted. Not exaggerated. Just corrected. Each statement grounded in fact. Each word placed carefully. No emotion. No accusation. Just truth. The effect was immediate. Not dramatic. But decisive. The guests began to engage differently. They asked more questions. Not broader ones. Focused ones. Specific. And this time, the direction remained consistent. Toward clarity. Not presentation. The younger guest wrote continuously now. The second guest nodded occasionally. And the senior guest listened. Closely. Then came the moment Silas had avoided entirely. A question quiet but unmistakable. Regarding legal matters. Pending issues. Things not mentioned earlier. Silas paused. Just briefly. Then answered. But this time, the answer lacked structure. It was incomplete. Carefully worded. Designed to minimize. That was when I spoke again. Not over him. After him. Clarifying the situation. The nature of the disputes. The timeline. The current status. Nothing added. Nothing removed. Just what existed. And in doing so, what had been hidden became visible. There's a difference between making a mistake and leaving something out. One can be corrected. The other changes perception. The guests understood that difference immediately. Because business isn't built on perfection. It's built on transparency. And what they were seeing now was not transparency. The conversation shifted again. Naturally. Toward assets. Toward stability. Toward what supported everything Silas had presented. And once again, he answered. Carefully. But not completely. So I completed it. Calmly explaining the situation regarding the house. Ownership. Status. What had been decided. And what had not. No commentary. No judgment. Just fact. But facts, when revealed at the right moment, carry weight far beyond explanation. At this point, the change in the room was unmistakable. Silas was no longer leading the discussion. He was responding to it. And not always successfully. His tone shifted. Slightly tighter. More deliberate. Less assured. Because control isn't something you can hold on to once it's been taken by truth. The senior guest finally spoke again. Not to challenge. Not to accuse. But to conclude a line of thought. His tone remained respectful. But firm. Measured. He thanked Silas for his time. Acknowledged the discussion. Then added that certain matters would need to be reviewed further before any decisions could be made. A pause. Then a slight inclination of his head. Polite. Final. The second guest followed with a brief statement of appreciation. The younger one closed his notebook. And just like that, the direction of the evening had changed completely. Some say she went too far, others say not far enough. What do you think? When truth is ignored, Should it be revealed quietly? Or completely? What made the moment powerful wasn't volume. There was no argument, no interruption, no scene. Everything remained composed, professional, respectful. And that's what made it undeniable. Because nothing I said could be dismissed as emotional. Nothing could be reduced to reaction. It was all simply there. Clear, structured, unavoidable. By the time the conversation reached its natural end, there was no confusion left in the room. Not about the business, not about the decisions, and certainly not about me. The role Silas had assigned. Quiet, uninvolved, unaware, no longer existed. And in its place was something he had never prepared for. Silas sat back slowly, not in confidence, but in realization. Because some outcomes don't need to be announced. They're understood. And this one had already been decided. Not by force, not by confrontation, but by something far more difficult to argue against. Truth delivered at the right time. The evening didn't end abruptly. There was no dramatic exit. No raised voices. No visible conflict. Instead, it concluded the same way it had begun. With composure. Polite acknowledgments were exchanged. Chairs moved back carefully. Hands met briefly across the table. But something fundamental had changed. The tone remained respectful. The outcome did not. Silas attempted one last effort. A final statement. Measured. Carefully phrased. He spoke about future discussions. About revisiting certain details. About continuing the conversation beyond that evening. But the responses he received were different now. Short. Neutral. Non-committal. The kind of replies that sound courteous, but carry no intention. Because decisions like this aren't always announced directly. Sometimes, they're simply understood. And this one had already been made. We walked out of the restaurant together. Not side by side, but not far apart either. The distance between us wasn't physical. It was something else. Something neither of us addressed immediately. Silas didn't speak at first, which, in itself, said more than anything he could have said. Because silence, when it comes from someone who always has something to say, means something has shifted. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Lower. Less certain. "What was that?" he asked. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just unsettled. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because some questions don't require immediate response. They require reflection. "I told the truth," I said calmly. "Nothing more. Nothing less." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You didn't have to do that," he replied. But that wasn't entirely accurate. I did. Not for him. For myself. Because what had been said at that table, about me, about my life, had already crossed a line. Silas stopped walking, turning slightly toward me. "There were ways to handle that," he said, still trying to regain control of the situation, still speaking as though this was a matter of strategy, of presentation. But the difference now was this. The conversation was no longer his to direct. "You handled it your way," I replied. And I handled it mine. Simple. Clear. Unarguable. The following days confirmed what had already been set in motion. Silas didn't say much about it at first. But he didn't need to. The calls stopped coming. The follow-ups he expected never arrived. Messages that once received quick responses went unanswered. And when replies finally did come, they were formal, distant, carefully worded. the kind that closed doors without announcing it. In business, reputation doesn't collapse all at once. It changes in subtle ways. Conversations become shorter. Invitations become less frequent. Trust becomes conditional. Silas began to notice it. Not immediately, but gradually. A meeting that didn't get confirmed. A partnership that stalled. A conversation that ended sooner than expected. Each moment small on its own. But together, they formed a pattern. The deal itself didn't just fade. It disappeared. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just quietly. Replaced by other opportunities. Other partnerships. Other decisions. And Silas was no longer part of them. Because once doubt is introduced at that level, it doesn't disappear easily. It stays. And it spreads. But the loss wasn't limited to business. It extended further. Into areas he hadn't considered. The confidence he carried into rooms. Changed. The certainty in his voice. Softened. Not entirely. But enough. Because once you've been exposed, truly exposed, you don't walk the same way again. Have you ever watched someone lose something? Not because they weren't capable, but because of the choices they made when it mattered most. What would you call that? Bad luck? Or consequence? As for me, nothing about my life needed to change. Because I had never built it on presentation. Or assumption. What I had remained. My home. My independence. My decisions. Still mine. Exactly as they had always been. Silas and I spoke less after that. Not out of anger, but because something fundamental had shifted. Not broken. Just altered. There are moments that redefine relationships. Not loudly, but permanently. And this was one of them. He lost more than a deal that night. More than an opportunity. He lost certainty. Control. And perhaps most importantly, the version of me he thought he understood. And once that version disappears, there's no returning to it. It was a few days later when he came to see me. Unannounced. That alone told me something had changed. Silas had always preferred control. Schedules. Timing. But this wasn't planned. This was reaction. I heard the knock before I saw him. Steady. Not hesitant. But not confident either. Somewhere in between. I opened the door. And there he was. Standing there, without the certainty he used to carry so easily. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Because sometimes words don't come first. Recognition does. I saw it in his posture. In the way he held himself. Less rigid. Less certain. And in his eyes. Something unfamiliar. Not weakness. Not fear. But awareness. The kind that comes after something has already been lost. "Can I come in?" he asked. Simple. Direct. I stepped aside without answering. He walked in slowly, looking around as though the space felt different. But nothing had changed here. Everything was exactly where it had always been. He didn't sit immediately. Didn't launch into explanation. He stood for a moment, as if searching for the right place to begin. Then finally, "I've been trying to fix things," he said. Not looking at me. Just speaking. "They're not responding. The deal, it's gone." I didn't interrupt. Because I already knew. "I didn't think it would go like that," he added. A pause. Then, "I didn't expect you to." He stopped himself. Because the sentence didn't need finishing. We both knew what he meant. "You embarrassed me," he said finally. And there it was. Not an apology. Not yet. Just a statement. Centered on himself. I told the truth, I replied. The same words as before. Unchanged. Because truth doesn't need adjustment. It remains the same, regardless of when it's spoken. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging it, but not fully accepting it. There was another pause. Longer this time. And then his voice shifted. Lower. Quieter. I shouldn't have said those things about you, he admitted. Not rushed. Not defensive. Just stated. I didn't mean it like that. A familiar phrase. One people use when they realize meaning isn't the issue. Impact is. You said exactly what you meant, I replied. Not harsh. Not raised. Just clear. Because intention reveals itself in moments like that. Not under pressure. Not by accident. But through choice. And he had made his. Silas looked at me then. Directly. Searching for something. Understanding. Maybe even forgiveness. I was trying to protect the deal, he said. As if that explained everything. As if that justified the decision. But it didn't. Because protecting something should never require discarding someone. Especially not like that. You're not sorry for what you said, I told him calmly. You're sorry for what it cost you. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled. Exactly where they were meant to. And he felt it. You could see it in the way he looked away. Not in anger, but in recognition. Have you ever heard an apology? And knew immediately it wasn't about you. That it came from loss. Not from understanding. What would you do in that moment? Accept it. Or see it for what it is. I didn't come here to argue, he said quietly. I wanted to fix things. But some things aren't fixed through conversation alone. They require change. And change isn't proven in words. It's shown in time. I hope you do, I replied. Simple. Honest. But not an invitation. There was no lecture. No raised voice. No long explanation. Because boundaries don't need to be explained in detail. They need to be clear. And mine was. I wasn't angry. I wasn't hurt in the way he expected. I was simply done accepting less than what I deserved. Silas stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for something else. But nothing else came. Because everything that needed to be said had already been said. He nodded once, quietly, then turned and walked toward the door. No argument. No resistance. Just acceptance. When the door closed behind him, the silence that followed felt different. Not heavy. Not unresolved. Just still. Because closure doesn't always come with emotion. Sometimes, it comes with clarity. And clarity leaves nothing left to question. After he left, the house returned to its usual rhythm. No raised voices. No lingering tension. Just stillness. The kind that doesn't ask for attention. I moved through the rooms slowly. Not because anything had changed, but because I was aware of everything now in a different way. The chair by the window. The table where I had spent years making decisions, small ones, important ones. The walls that had held memories, long before anyone thought to assign them value. Everything remained. Exactly as it should be. I didn't question what I had done. Not once. Because there was nothing unclear about it. I didn't act out of anger. I didn't speak to prove a point. I responded because a line had been crossed. And when that happens, silence is no longer the right choice. There's a difference between patience and permission. And that night, I stopped giving permission. Respect isn't something you demand loudly. It isn't something you force. It's something that's revealed in how people treat you. Especially when they believe you won't respond. Silas didn't lose that deal because I spoke. He lost it because of what he chose to say before I did. Because people notice more than we think. They listen. They observe. And when the truth becomes clear, they act accordingly. Being underestimated can feel like an insult, but it can also be an advantage. Because when someone decides you're not worth paying attention to, they stop preparing for you. They stop considering what you might know, what you might understand, what you might do. And that's where mistakes happen. Not loud ones, not obvious ones, but quiet decisions that carry consequences later. Silas didn't fail because he lacked ability. He failed because he assumed I lacked it. The outcome of that night wasn't immediate. It didn't arrive with noise or headlines. It unfolded in small, steady ways. Missed opportunities. Changed conversations. Doors that didn't open again. That's how consequence works. Not always dramatic, but always consistent. And once it begins, it continues. Think about this. Have you ever stayed quiet while someone decided who you were? Have you ever been overlooked, only to realize later that silence was costing you more than speaking ever would? What would you have done in my place? Stayed quiet, or chosen a different moment to respond? For me, the lesson was simple. Know when to listen, and know when to speak. Because both require strength, but only one changes how others see you. And more importantly, how you see yourself. I didn't raise my voice that night. I didn't argue. I didn't force anything. I simply chose the right moment and told the truth. People will treat you based on what they believe you'll accept, not what you deserve. And the moment you change what you accept, everything else begins to change with it. Not immediately, not dramatically, but clearly and permanently. Still not subscribed? Tell me why in the comments. Was she right or too harsh?